Hey y'all, I'm Emily, an almost lifelong quilter with a lot of stories to tell. I have loved quilts and talking about them for as long as I can remember, and I'm here to celebrate the tradition of quilting with you. From family heirlooms to thrift store finds, every quilt holds a piece of history and a little piece of a quilter's heart. Join me every other week to get back to your quilting roots. We'll celebrate quilts and the real people who made them, learn a little bit about the history of quilting, and have lots of fun exploring ways to reclaim tradition in a modern world. I'm so glad you're joining me this week here at Patchwork Revival. Hey y'all, welcome to the Patchwork Revival podcast. This is the podcast that celebrates the generational connection that we find through quilting. I'm your host, Emily, and this is a special episode. We'll go into why this week is so special to me and why I really wanted to jump in and record this episode at this specific time. But just a quick kind of overview of everything. I am working through recording content for the spring. I'm really excited for what the podcast has to offer. This is going to be a quick solo episode. We may have a couple solo episodes coming up because I just had a baby, so I'm home with a newborn. And if you've had a newborn, you kind of know that makes it a little bit difficult to schedule and plan things because they have a schedule all of their own that they really don't like to share with us. So just bear with me. I hope that I still have some really interesting content to bring you guys and that you still enjoy these shows. I do have some things coming up with some guest interviews that I'm really excited to share with you guys. So I hope you're enjoying the podcast. Remember that leaving a review is one of the best ways to support the podcast. That's the best way to offer support because it helps show the podcast to more people on their platform of choice. We've had some really awesome reviews. I'm so appreciative of everyone who took the time to leave a review. I've read all of them and I really love reading them. It helps me sort of know what I'm doing right. Maybe gives me an idea of things that I could be doing better. Be sure to subscribe. Whatever platform you're on, you can subscribe so that you never miss an episode. So with that, let's dive into today's episode. This is a special episode because I wanted to commemorate my memory, my love, and my quilting journey that I've had with my mama. She was my grandmother. Her name was Coralie Newman, and she was really the catalyst behind me even starting the Patchwork Revival podcast, which I started almost a year ago. She would have been 101 this year, which was pretty awesome. She lived until she was 96. So we haven't had a whole lot of time without her, but she's one of those people who was a really special lady on a lot of different counts. But I wanted to share a little bit about her with you, and then we'll dive into 5 ways that she really contributed to me learning how to quilt and sticking with quilting. Back in the last episode, we had an interview with my friend Bree, and she talked a lot about what we can do to support and help teach beginners learn how to sew. And my hope is that this episode will take it one step farther because I really took time to sit and reflect on what did my mama do that really made quilting feel approachable and feel like my own and feel so special to me. So I took some time to reflect on that, and I wanted to share those thoughts with you today. Now, my mama was born on March 14th of 1924. So she weathered all these crazy historical events that we just have read about, a lot of us, like the Great Depression, World War II, the Cold War, not to mention, all the other craziness of the world since then. She was, on a personal note, widowed in 1985. She had 4 kids, ended up with 10 grandkids and tons of great grandkids who got to meet her and know her before she passed away in 2020. She was a really special lady. I found a really close relationship with her through quilting. And I do want to point out that she was such a multifaceted woman. She loved to read. She was really active in her community, especially through her church. And she made a huge impact on a lot of people's lives, not just mine, through a lot of different hobbies. But for me, it was quilting. That's kind of where we connected. And that's a lot of the special, really personal memories I have of her come from quilting together. So there is more of her particular story and her personal quilting story that I shared in episode 1. It's entitled Coralie. That was her first name. So if you're interested, check that out. Again, first episode of the podcast. Now, she probably would have been pretty embarrassed by being the center of attention of now multiple episodes, but I'm going to dedicate the beginning of March, the first episode of March every year, to a story about her or something that connects to her. Because at the end of the day, that's what this podcast is all about, connecting with all generations of quilters and remembering where our knowledge and our legacy has come from, and then acknowledging how we're passing that on to future generations. So, my mama taught me to quilt when I was about 7 or 8 years old. I honestly don't remember, but what I do know is that it has been life changing for me. So, I did take time to think about how she welcomed me into quilting, encouraged me throughout my learning, and I'm going to highlight a few of those things that I think we could all pass on to others as we welcome them into the quilting world. This is how we pass on a special art form, craft, whatever you want to call it, to other people. It's one thing to teach people, it's another thing to really encourage and almost mentor people through creativity and specifically through quilting. So, the first thing that I remember about when I asked my mama, I just asked her one day, Mama, I want to learn how to quilt. And I think the whole reason I wanted to do that is because I was reading the Little House books and Laura Ingalls Wilder. Laura Ingalls was doing her patchwork in the Little House in the Big Woods. And so I wanted to know how to do patchwork. I loved reading and I loved really imagining being in a story. So that's basically why I asked her. And I knew she quilted. She was the only person I really knew that could teach me how to do patchwork. So the number one thing that I remember is that my mama just said, sure. She totally believed in me. There was none of this hemming and hawing and thinking, oh, well, maybe in a couple years when you're a little bit older and you can handle the rotary cutter, or I don't know if you're old enough to use my sewing machine safely yet. There was just no hesitation. She said yes, and we just jumped right in. So I think that's important. It sounds really simple. The first thing is just believe in the person that's approaching you. Um, I think a lot about how sometimes I react to, especially my children. They're younger, but there's so many things that I'm like, oh, that's going to take forever if we sit and try to do that. And it's just quicker if I do it myself or something like that. There's always an excuse. But taking a pause and just recognizing you can just meet someone where they are and you can make it happen, make it work. So that was a big thing for me, is just knowing that she just said yes, was not a big deal. And we jumped right in. So there was never really any doubt that I would be able to do it. It was just, yeah, if you want to learn, you can do it. The second thing about my mama is that she was really willing to put in time with me, for me, but really with me. So, teaching anyone to do anything, I think we all know is a pretty big undertaking because you do really have to meet them where they are, start where they are, not necessarily where you think they should be, and that sort of thing. And quilting in particular is a long term commitment kind of thing. Even a single project, if you're doing a throw size or a bed size quilt, that can take um, forever. So we happened to be at her house whenever I asked her to teach me how to quilt. And she took several days to sit with me and teach me all of the steps that I would need to know and that I went through to make a quilt from start to finish. So we made a small 9 patch that could be used as a table topper or a wall hanging. Actually, my mama, this is really sweet, but she hung it on her wall. And so my first little 9-patch quilt was hanging on my mama's wall like it was some fine art piece, after I finished it. So go back to number 1. She believed in me and was really supportive and encouraging. It spoke a lot to me that she was really willing to sit and take the time to teach me how to do what she knew how to do. So we hand pieced everything, and that meant she had to teach me how to thread a needle, how to sew. I hand pieced. She had to trust me to work with a needle. She did use the rotary cutter so that I wouldn't chop my hand or my finger off. And I think that's totally reasonable. But she just sat with me and walked me through everything. Didn't have to be perfect. I did have to do it properly, but it didn't have to be perfect. And she was there the whole time, teaching me what to do, teaching me how to do it better, and then letting me just do it myself with her supervising. So once I finished that first little quilt and kind of learned the steps, it was time for us to go home. We lived several hours away from my grandmother. It was probably, I think it was like a 7-hour drive from where we were. So we would typically go for about a week at a time. And by that time, it was time to leave. And I had told her, whoa, this is so cool. She could tell, I think, that I really enjoyed everything and what I was doing with her making quilts. So when she kind of figured that out, she had asked me if I would like her to help me make a quilt that would be big enough that I could use it. And I said, yeah. And so what she did for me was take the time to go pick out a pattern that was an approachable, sort of traditional patchwork block. It was called the Prairie Queen block. It's one of my favorite blocks ever. Um, if you're watching the YouTube video, if you look over my shoulder here, you'll see my Prairie Queen remix quilt hanging on my quilt ladder. And it's there for this particular reason because I'm going to talk about it and I just love that pattern. And now you know why. Um, so she went to Walmart. That's where she got her fabric. That's just what she had available. So she went and she picked out different blue, like woven and floral fabrics to put together in this quilt top, or sorry, as this quilt pattern. And then she went and she took the time to cut all of the pieces for a full size quilt. Yes, a full sized quilt. Go back to number 1. The woman believed in me. And so when I say full, I mean like a full double bed size quilt. That was my first big usable quilt that I ever made. But I made it because of her. And so she cut all that fabric out. First off, she picked the fabric for me. It was all different kinds of blues. I'll share photos of it in the show notes. I know I've shared it many times before, but she went ahead and cut, all that fabric out and organized all the pieces in this little like shirt box that I'd be able to just pick what I needed. And the funny thing, this was, in the 90s sometime. And so the pattern she was using, um, there's like 4-patch units. Well, those were not strip pieced 4-patch units. Those were individual 2.5-inch squares that were pieced together. And the half square triangles were not made with an efficient, like 2 or 4 or 8 at a time method. They were made by cutting a square, a fabric square at some weird dimension, probably something in 7/8 or whatever, and then cut on the diagonal. So there were all these bias edges and things like that. But the point is, I really despise cutting. And the fact that she sat and did that for me probably was part of why I was able to just jump in and get that project done. Because I think if I would have had to sit and cut, number 1, I probably would have made a lot of mistakes. Number 2, I probably would have just totally stalled out because, woof, that was so much cutting. And then The way she sat and organized it for me, it just made a huge difference to my success. The other thing is that whenever I finished that quilt top, she took it, and then went to her quilting group. So every week, she would meet with her quilting group, and they would hand quilt a quilt around a frame at their church. That was their kind of social activity that she was involved in. I'm pretty sure it was on Wednesdays, if I remember correctly. But they would go and like all day they would sit around and quilt on a quilt. And so every month, a different lady got to put up a project. And so my mama used her rotation to put my quilt up and have it hand quilted by the quilting ladies. And then when it was finished, she took the time to put the binding on and stitch it down for me. Again, I think a lot of this was stuff that she knew would be a little bit difficult for me or take forever and probably be discouraging. And the fact that she was willing to take the time to do those things for me, and she still showed me how to do it, but it got done, and that was such a good feeling because I really felt like I had accomplished something. So I ended up with a finished, like, double bed-sized quilt that was ready to use, and that was so awesome. The third thing that my mama did to encourage me was just be really, really generous with her things. I think we all know quilting can turn into a really expensive and really space taxing habit. So if you don't have a lot of space or you don't have a lot of money, it's kind of hard to get started in quilting, much less continue it. So if when I first wanted to get started quilting, she gave me fabric. She just told me, "Go look in my fabric and pick out whatever you like," and, I did. So I ended up having different kinds of fabric that I really liked that I was able to be creative with and have ideas with. Um, she gave me needles, she gave me some thread, um, she taught me how to use a rotary cutter eventually, and I think she gave me, like, a little ruler I could use. She showed me what kind of blade I should get and all kinds of things, so that really just lowered the barrier to entry for me, and when I think about people who have approached me asking, "Oh, I wish I could learn how to quilt. Do you think you could teach me sometime?" I'm like, "Sure," and I think a lot about especially fabric. I'm more than willing to just let someone come, look through a lot of my fabric, and pick stuff out that they might like or think that they would use, so that was a big part of how she kind of welcomed me into quilting was just being generous. What's mine is yours. Come use what you need. Or she would at least help me by sharing her knowledge of telling me this is probably the size of cutting mat you would get. This is the size ruler you should get. And you probably just need one to start off and all these things. So um, there was no, you know, figure it out on your own or, pay me $20 to teach you how to do this. I mean, she was my grandmother, but um, I think just realizing that if someone is really interested in this, just jump in with them and welcome them into this because it can be a really life-changing thing. So it's a priceless thing to be able to teach someone how to quilt and to sort of spark and ignite a love of quilting in someone. The fourth thing that mama did that encouraged me as a quilter and still encourages me as a quilter is that she always was doing something different. She did all different kinds of quilts. She did traditional piecing. She did piecing with templates. She did some foundation paper piecing. I specifically remember seeing her working on a foundation paper pieced um, double wedding ring quilt where the arcs were FPP. Um, and then obviously the other bits were like cutout template. She also did a lot of applique. She really liked this kind of rustic, whimsical stuff. Like I remember she did one applique block of the month that sort of depicted a seasonal scene every month. She did a Santa Claus quilt, like kind of a homespun, cottagey angel quilt that was appliqued. She did a lot of applique, and I think some of that is because she could just sort of sit and not be at her sewing machine, but do handwork. She really liked doing handwork, I think. She also did embroidery. So she did red work. If you've never heard of red work, it's a traditional technique of embroidering different designs and then basically putting them on like a, 10 by 10 or 12 by 12 square and then setting those together, with sashing or without, just kind of whatever the pattern or your mind called for. And then you would sort of just quilt around the embroidered design to make it pop. It was a lot of like scenic things like, a little boy fishing or a little girl doing this or that or whatever, just sort of different things. But she did like doing embroidery and red work, and she did a lot of it with, red thread, as was sort of the traditional thing, but she also did blues, brown. I remember a lot of quilts that she ended up doing that way. So she did like to do that too. But the point is, I don't think ever really took a formal class to learn how to do any of this stuff. She just kind of grew up in an era where that's what you learned to do, especially as a little girl, growing up. You did mending, you did tatting, you did crochet, um, embroidery, quilting, and doing patchwork. So this was all just kind of skills that she had, but she was always using them and doing different things, just kind of based on what she wanted to do. So I feel like she set a really good example for me of what creative freedom looked like. And you know what? If this is how you want to do something, go do it. Not every quilt is strip pieced for patch, or not every quilt has flying geese in it, or whatever. So she was always doing different things. She always had different projects going. And I really liked seeing all of her projects. And she would show them to me and say, "This is what I'm working on. This is how I'm doing it." So I just always got exposure and just a little bit more knowledge about quilting and what it could look like, and what I think that helped me kind of form my ideas of what I wanted it to look like for me. So it kind of helped me hone my style, but it also just helped me really be knowledgeable about how wide the sort of practice of quilting can be. So thanks, Mama. You taught me a lot. The fifth thing, this one is, I think, the most important. And this is where I would challenge each of us to really figure out, how can we do this? But my mama welcomed me into her quilting community. From the minute I expressed interest, she sort of had me under her wing. And whether it was just us at her house, looking at her projects, talking about her projects, imagining the next project that I wanted to do. When I would visit her, I would bring a project to look at. If I needed help basting something, she would help me. If I needed help figuring out how to do something, she would help me. So you can have a community just with two people. That's it. She also invited me to be part of her sort of broader quilting community. So I got to go with her as a kid. I was probably 10 or 12. I don't know. I was visiting her, and I was there for a week in the summer, and it was quilting day, the day that she would go to the church and quilt with the quilting ladies. And instead of skipping that week or whatever, I got to go with her. And maybe that's because it was her quilt that was being quilted at the time. But I like to think it's because she just thought I would have fun and enjoy it. So I got to go sit with the ladies at the quilting parsonage. That's what they called it. They were in the parsonage building at the church. That's where they worked. And I got to sit, and I even got to put some stitches in the quilt. I got to do my hand quilting, and which she had taught me to do. But the way the ladies would quilt these quilts was with like kind of the old-fashioned, very traditional, fine, tiny stitches, like, the tinier the better, and I know mine weren't that great. They weren't horrible, but they were not great. But that wasn't the point. I was there, I was welcome, I got to have fun, I got to learn something, I got to meet different ladies, and I got to really witness how special community between quilters could be. I still remember that so well. I'm 37 now, and I still have like a vivid memory of getting to go. And I think that even now, you know, obviously my mama is not here. Even if she was, I don't live in the same place where she lived. But I think it gave me a little bit of confidence to sort of recognize, okay, I know what this is like. I know that I can go to a quilting meeting if I want to and show up and make friends or talk about quilting or whatever the case may be. Um, so taking someone under your wing and really welcoming them into the broader community, I think is a really special thing to do. And I think it's really important. Some of us aren't really able to do this. Like some of us don't really know people who quilt in real life. And some of that, maybe it means you could go out to a local meeting or guild and try to meet people, make a friend or two, and have your own kind of quilting days together or coffee meetups, even or whatever. And for some of us, our community is online through social media or different things like that. And that's amazing. I would just encourage you to remember that, once you're kind of established and entrenched and you're feeling comfortable, like, oh, this is my style, this is my place in the quilting world, and this is what I like to do, maybe think about how you can welcome other people to kind of join you. Um, I've been kind of trying to think about this and challenge myself a little bit about this. And honestly, that's part of why I made this podcast, is because I'm hoping people will understand that this is here to sort of serve the quilting community. I'm trying to share knowledge that I have, and it may not be that much and it may not be that groundbreaking, but there may be like two people out there who are like, whoa, I never knew that. Or, oh, cool, I want to Google red work and see what it is because I love embroidering. And that's really what it's all about. It's just helping people navigate the whole world of quilting because it is pretty overwhelming, honestly. So many quilts, so little time. So, helping someone sort of see and find their way, I think, is a pretty cool thing. And I'm really, really thankful that my mama took the time to sort of welcome me into her quilting world, which really is the quilting world because we're all connected to each other through this incredible art form. Thank y'all for being here. I know this was kind of a quick episode. I've been sick for the last couple of days, so I don't know how much longer my voice is gonna kind of last, but those are all the things that my mama did for me as a beginner quilter. She believed in me. She put the time in with me. Like she was right there with me. And it took a lot of time and probably a lot of patience, but she was there and she did it. And I stuck with it. She was really generous with her things as well as her time. She set a great example of what creativity looked like by always having different projects and different things and being willing to try things. She was a learner herself and really set that example for me. And then she welcomed me into her community and made me feel confident as part of the quilting community. So, if you've sat through this long, I wanted to tell a quick little story. So I mentioned that her quilting group, they call themselves the Quilting Ladies, and they were a group of ladies at a small Baptist church in rural East Texas. And this little Baptist church had off to the side, one of the buildings was called the parsonage. And I guess back in the day, like the pastor or the preacher would live there, and that's what that was for. But as things kind of went on, it was like, well, the parsonage just got used for little things like There was a kitchen in there so they could warm up stuff for like a potluck or whatever, and nobody was really living there. Well, they started this quilting group, a group of ladies, including my mama, and the pastor at the church was like, "Well, if y'all need a place to come, why don't y'all use the parsonage building?" So they've used this building for years, and you can imagine they needed kind of a big room. So there was like bedrooms in the house that were big enough that they could put a big quilt out on a frame to hand quilt it and all be able to get around it to do the quilting. So they used this for years and years, and they began to kind of grow, their group began to grow, and they started, basically hosting a quilt show for their community where they would put up their quilt. They would all also group together to piece a quilt and hand quilt it, and they would raffle that quilt off at the quilt show. Um, and by doing all this, they would raise money, and they used that money to do things like buy a new air conditioner for the building where they were quilting in the sweltering, jungle of East Texas in the summer. I don't know what all they did, but they used that money to sort of fix up the building, keep it shored up so that they could quilt there and be comfortable. They would go there all day. So they would bring lunches and snacks and all kinds of stuff. So just kind of, it was like their little quilting home and their hub. Well, in 2020, my mama passed away. And she lived just up the street. Literally, you could just go up, it was about 2 minutes from the church to her house. So it was just up the street. And after she passed away, her house, um, long story short, a family member ended up buying her house and then was renting it out and ended up renting it to a um, church leader who took over this small Baptist church where the quilting ladies previously had been quilting. And this family member over time started hearing things about how this new leader of the church was really upsetting a lot of the older congregation members. They changed the name of the church, which, you know, felt kind of strange for people who had been there for generations, like literally generations of people had grown up and, had babies, had weddings, had family members' funerals at that church. And all of a sudden, just overnight, it was like totally, changed. And change is hard for anybody, especially for something that was kind of like almost an institution for the community. And the other thing that this church leader did was basically approach the quilting ladies and said, "Well, we need to take over this parsonage building um, that you guys have worked really hard to maintain by hosting quilt shows, repairing things, improving things. We need that building. We're going to take over that building so y'all can't be there anymore." Talk about, ugh, that gives me the icks. It just made me so angry, um, really angry. And we were kind of horrified. I was told this story by my aunt, who is still kind of plugged into that community, the local community. Well, our family member who owned my mama's house caught wind of this. And if you'll remember, part of the story was that this church leader had been renting and living in my mama's house. So my family member heard of this and approached this church leader and said, "I'm really sorry, but you're going to have to leave. We're not going to rent this house out anymore. So you have to find somewhere else to live." And that was kind of that from that standpoint. Then they called the quilting ladies and said, "You guys can use Mama's house for your quilting." And so talk about things coming full circle. I love this story so much because Mama and her friends, the quilting ladies, invested a lot of time and a lot of love and a lot of labor into their community. And even though my mama passed away, I still like to think that she had a hand in all this because I'm going to tell you that woman was stubborn and she would just not have stood for that. For her quilting group to just be totally left high and dry with nowhere to meet. And how poetic is that? That now the quilting ladies are meeting in her house. There's a kitchen. I like to imagine them still gathering around the table to have lunch together when they're taking a break. There are several rooms. I'm sure one of them is stuffed with fabric and things like that. The big living room, I just like to imagine it has a big um, area where the quilting frame is out. And I just love that picture and I just love that story so much. So it made me feel really good. I wanted to share it with y'all because there are not a lot of stories going around these days that make us feel good or wholesome. And that's one that when I heard it, I was like, oh man, that's awesome. And I have to share it with people who will love that story the same way I do. So there you go. That's it for this edition of the podcast. I hope you enjoyed everything that we've talked about. I hope that it sparks a little something in you and kind of inspires you to reach out to someone or to sort of expand your own community and your own practice of quilting. Leave me a comment, send me a message, kind of let me know if you have any other ideas that I can share with people of how to welcome someone into the community, how to teach someone to quilt, your favorite beginner patterns, anything like that. Drop a comment or you can find me on Instagram at Patchwork Revival Studios. Send me a message there. I'm usually able to check them and can usually get back to people. So I'm working on improving my website so that my show notes will all be in one place and that I'll have a better email domain that you guys could send me emails at. But I really welcome listener feedback, listener ideas, just anything. Reach out to me. I'm a real person. Let me know. You are welcome to be part of my community and my, quilty circle of friends. So reach out if you feel like it. With that, I'll leave y'all to it. Have a wonderful week. And we'll see you next time on the Patchwork Revival podcast. Bye, y'all. Well, that's it for this episode of Patchwork Revival. I loved having you here with me talking all things quilty. Don't forget to subscribe to the show and leave a rave review. If you don't really have a lot of nice things to say, it's okay to say nothing. Also, be sure to jump down to the show notes to find links for this episode, as well as the link to my shop where you can enjoy 15% off as a podcast listener with code REVIVAL. Remember that the Patchwork Revival podcast is here to celebrate the connection made in the quilts we love. I'll see you next time.